There is a question that sits at the heart of every serious study of the 20th century. Not who started the Second World War, but how an entire civilization, educated, industrialized, and supposedly enlightened, allowed itself to arrive at a moment where tens of millions of human beings would be consumed by a conflict spanning 6 continents and every ocean on Earth. This is not a simple story. It never was. It is not a story of monsters against heroes, though monsters did exist and heroes did rise. It is the story of a world that had already fought one catastrophic war, buried its dead, signed its treaties, built its institutions, and then, within 2 decades, walked straight back into the fire. And it walked in willingly. That is the part that keeps historians awake. If you are watching this because you want to understand World War II, not just the battles and the dates, but the logic of it, the grinding machinery of cause and consequence, then you are exactly who this documentary was made for. This film is roughly 4 hours long. It was built to be watched in one sitting, or in chapters across several evenings, or perhaps late at night when the world is quiet and history feels somehow closer. We are going to begin before the first shot, because the first shot is never really the beginning. We are going to travel back to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, to the conference table where the victors of the First World War sat down to design the future, and instead drafted a blueprint for the next catastrophe. We will follow the slow poisoning of the Weimar Republic, the Italian gamble in Africa, the Japanese march through Manchuria, and the moment a failed Austrian painter stood before a crowd in Munich and told a broken people exactly what they wanted to hear. Then we will follow the war itself, from the pre-dawn artillery that opened on the Polish defences at Westerplatte on the 1st of September 1939, to the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September 1945. 6 years and 1 day during which the world was remade. There are 15 chapters in this documentary. Each one covers a distinct phase of the war. Together, they form a complete account, not a summary, but a study. We have drawn from the historiographical record, from Anthony Beevor, from Richard Overy, from the National World War II Museum Archive, from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and from the primary timeline established by the WE Foundation and the Britannica Record. Where historians debate, we will tell you they debate. Where the record is clear, we will be precise. History does not owe us clean narratives, but it does owe us honesty. Now, before we begin, a word about what you are about to hear. This documentary does not glorify the conflict. It does not celebrate the machinery of destruction. What it does is take seriously the obligation to understand. Because the world that emerged from 1945, the United Nations, the Cold War, the decolonization of Asia and Africa, the European Union, the nuclear age, every structure that shapes the world you live in today was built directly on the ruins of this war. You cannot understand the present without understanding this. So, let us begin. If this is the kind of long-form, deeply researched history that you want on your screen, hit subscribe before you forget, and leave a comment below telling us, which chapter of World War II do you think is the most misunderstood? We read every single one. Chapter 1, The World That Broke, Europe. After the First World War, 1918 to 1929. To understand why the Second World War happened, you have to understand what the First World War did to the people who survived it. Not merely what it cost in territory or treasure, though the accounting there is staggering, but what it did to the European mind. The men who came home from the trenches of the Western Front came home to a continent that had lost, by the most conservative estimates, somewhere between 15 and 17 million human beings in 4 years of industrial slaughter. They came home to economies stretched to their breaking points, to governments that had spent money they did not have on weapons they could not afford, and to a peace conference convening in Paris that would, in the judgment of many historians, produce one of the most consequential documents of the modern era, the Treaty of Versailles, for entirely the wrong reasons. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January of 1919. At its centre sat three men: David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Wilson arrived with his 14 points, a vision of a post-war order built on self-determination, open diplomacy, and collective security. Clemenceau arrived with something simpler: a determination to ensure that Germany could never threaten France again. The historian Margaret Macmillan has written that the war must be someone's fault, and that was a very natural human reaction. France made sure that fault was assigned, in writing, with interest. The treaty that emerged imposed on Germany the loss of roughly 13% of its home territory, all of its overseas colonial possessions, the demilitarization of the Rhineland, and a requirement to accept sole responsibility for the war under what became known as the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. On top of this came reparations, a figure that would be set eventually at 132 billion gold marks. The German General Staff was dissolved. Limits were placed on the size of its standing army. Its navy was surrendered, then scuttled by its own officers at Scapa Flow rather than handed over. An act that became one of the founding myths of German naval pride. Here is the historiographical tension that still exercises scholars. The debate is not whether Versailles was harsh. It was. The debate is whether it was uniquely, specifically responsible for what followed. Richard Overy and others have pushed back against the simple determinism, the idea that Versailles caused Hitler. The treaty created conditions. Those conditions were then exploited by specific choices made by specific people. The distinction matters because it is the difference between history as tragedy and history as crime. What the treaty undeniably did was create a vast reservoir of grievance that political operators could draw from. The Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, the claim that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield but betrayed from within, became the central propaganda currency of the German far right throughout the 1920s. It was factually false. The German army was exhausted, its supply lines collapsing, its allies suing for peace. But a myth does not need to be true to be politically powerful. It needs only to be emotionally satisfying to people who have lost something they believed was theirs by right. Italy provides a parallel lesson that is often overlooked. Italy had fought alongside the Allies. Italian soldiers died by the hundreds of thousands in the grinding campaigns along the Isonzo River. Italy had been promised, in the Treaty of London, signed in 1915, the Italian inhabited lands of Fiume and Dalmatia in exchange for entering the war. At Paris, those promises were not honoured. The lands went to the newly created Yugoslavia instead. Italian nationalists called it a vittoria mutilata, a mutilated victory. A nation that had paid in blood and received contempt in return was now emotionally primed for a man who promised to restore its dignity. His name was Benito Mussolini. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government established in Germany after the Kaiser's abdication, was born under conditions almost designed to ensure its failure. It was associated in the public mind with defeat and humiliation. It was attacked from the right by nationalists and from the left by communists. Its currency collapsed in the Great Inflation of 1923, when the government printed trillions of marks to cover its debts, destroying the savings of the middle class virtually overnight. A loaf of bread that cost 200 marks in January of 1923 cost 80 billion marks by November of the same year. The numbers are so large they feel almost fictional. But for the German family that watched its life savings evaporate in the space of months, they were devastatingly real. The 1920s brought a measure of stabilization. The Dawes Plan of 1924 restructured German reparations payments with American loans, and the mid-decade period saw something approaching political normality. German cinema flourished. Bauhaus architecture changed the aesthetic of the modern world. The Jazz Age touched Berlin as deeply as it touched New York. For a few years, the Weimar Republic functioned, but it was functioning on borrowed money from the United States and borrowed time. Then, in October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The Great Depression spread with devastating speed across the Atlantic. American banks called in their loans to Germany. Unemployment in Germany, which had been falling through the mid-decade, surged towards 6 million by the early 1930s, roughly 30% of the workforce. The political center, already weakened, fractured completely. Coalition governments formed and collapsed in rapid succession. The Weimar Constitution, which required proportional representation, produced a parliament that splintered into a dozen parties incapable of governing. Into that paralysis walked Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And the world that had been broken at Versailles in 1919 was now cracking open at its foundation. Chapter 2: The Rise of Fascism, Germany, Italy, and Japan, 1929 to 1936. The word fascism has been used so loosely in contemporary discourse that it has almost lost its historical precision. For the purposes of this documentary, we will use it carefully in its documented 20th century sense. A political movement characterized by ultranationalism, the subordination of the individual to the state, the rejection of parliamentary democracy, a cult of violence and sacrifice, and an aggressive expansionist foreign policy, driven by the belief that a nation's greatness must be measured against the weakness of its neighbors. By that definition, the 1930s saw three distinct fascist or fascist-adjacent regimes come to power in three of the world's major industrial nations, and all three would eventually find each other. Adolf Hitler's path to power was not a coup. That is an important technical point. He attempted a coup once. In Munich in November of 1923, the so-called Beer Hall Putsch, and it failed catastrophically. He was arrested, tried, and served a reduced sentence in Landsberg prison, where he dictated the first volume of Mein Kampf. His route to power, after that failure, was electoral. The Nazi Party contested elections, won seats in the Reichstag, and built a mass movement. By the election of July 1932, the Nazis had become the single largest party in the German parliament, with over 37% of the vote. On the 30th of January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. What followed over the next 18 months was the methodical dismantling of every institution that stood between Hitler and absolute power. The Reichstag fire of February 1933 provided the pretext for emergency decrees suspending civil liberties. The Enabling Act of March 1933 transferred legislative power to the cabinet, meaning to Hitler. Political parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. The judiciary was brought to heel. When Hindenburg died in August of 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor into a single position he called Führer, leader. He then required the German armed forces to swear a personal oath of loyalty, not to the German constitution, but to him as an individual. The Wehrmacht was now bound by sacred oath to Adolf Hitler. The implications of that oath would echo through every subsequent chapter of this documentary. In Italy, the process had moved faster, but with distinct local characteristics. Mussolini had come to power in October of 1922 through the March on Rome, a political theatre as much as a real military action. The Italian King Victor Emmanuel III, faced with what appeared to be a fascist army converging on the capital, chose to appoint Mussolini as prime minister rather than risk a confrontation. Over the following years, through intimidation, electoral manipulation, and the occasional murder of political opponents, most notoriously the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti in 1924, Mussolini consolidated a one-party state. He sought to build what he called a new Roman Empire, with Italy at the center of Mediterranean power. He was theatrical, often pompous, and possessed of a talent for political showmanship that Hitler studied carefully in the early 1930s. Japan presents the most structurally complex case of the three. Japan did not have a single charismatic dictator in the Hitler or Mussolini mold. What Japan had was a military establishment that had acquired, through a series of constitutional arrangements and customs, an effective veto over civilian government. The cabinet law required that the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy each nominate cabinet members before any government could be formed, giving the military the power to collapse any administration it found inconvenient. Below the senior officers, a culture of gekkokujo, institutionalized disobedience by junior officers, meant that radical factions within the army could initiate operations in the field that the civilian government in Tokyo had never authorized. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 is the defining example of this dynamic. In September of 1931, officers of the Kwantung Army, Japan's military force stationed in Manchuria, staged what became known as the Mukden Incident. They detonated a small explosive charge on the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden, blamed it on Chinese saboteurs, and used it as a pretext to seize the entire region within days. The civilian government in Tokyo learned of the operation essentially from the newspapers. The Kwantung Army established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installed the last Qing Emperor Puyi as a figurehead ruler, and dared the government at home to undo what had been done. The government did not. The precedent was established. The military could act, and Tokyo would follow. The League of Nations, the international body created in 1920 precisely to prevent this kind of aggression, condemned Japan's actions. Japan responded by withdrawing from the League entirely in March of 1933. The condemnation had no enforcement mechanism. Economic sanctions were discussed and largely not applied. The lesson absorbed by every aggressive government watching was unambiguous. The League would talk, it would not act. The organization that was supposed to be the guarantor of the post-war order had revealed, in its first serious test, that it had no teeth. Mussolini absorbed the same lesson 5 years later when Italy invaded Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia, in October of 1935. This was a colonial war, fought with modern weapons against a nation, armed mostly with rifles and courage. Ethiopia's emperor, Haile Selassie, addressed the League of Nations in Geneva on the 30th of June, 1936. In a speech that became one of the great moral documents of the era, he warned the assembled delegates, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." The delegates listened. The League imposed limited sanctions on oil sales, which proved ineffective. Italy annexed Ethiopia in May of 1936. Selassie was right. The failure to stop Mussolini in Africa did not satisfy him. It emboldened him. Germany's testing of the international system followed a pattern that Hitler himself described, making seemingly reasonable demands, accepting the concessions offered, then moving to the next demand. In March of 1936, in violation of both the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland. France had both the legal right and the military capacity to respond. It did nothing. Hitler later admitted privately that if France had moved, he would have had to order a withdrawal. The German army was not yet ready for a confrontation, but France did not move. The Rhineland was reoccupied without a single shot fired. The bluff had worked. Hitler drew the correct conclusion. The Western democracies would not fight to enforce their own treaties. By October of 1936, Germany and Italy had formalized their alignment in the Rome-Berlin axis. A month later, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, ostensibly an agreement to oppose communist expansion. But structurally, the the first formal diplomatic connection between the European and Asian branches of what would eventually become the Axis powers. Three industrial nations, each with a specific vision of territorial expansion, each with a history of perceived humiliation by the existing international order, had found each other. The world had 6 years of relative peace remaining. Some people could see it ending from there. Most could not or did not want to. Chapter 3: The Road to War, Spain, China, and the Failure of Appeasement, 1936 to 1939. There is a version of the years between 1936 and 1939 that treats them as a prologue, a slow build toward the inevitable. That version, while not entirely wrong, flattens something important. These years were not simply a countdown. They were a series of active choices made by real governments, each of which had the option to act differently. The failure of appeasement was not stupidity. It was a specific policy pursued for specific reasons, by men who had lived through one world war and were genuinely, desperately trying to prevent another. Understanding why they failed is not the same as excusing what they failed to prevent. The Spanish Civil War, which began in July of 1936, with a military uprising against the elected Republican government, became the first major testing ground for the weapons and tactics that would define the Second World War. Germany and Italy intervened on the side of General Francisco Franco's nationalist forces. Mussolini eventually sent more than 70,000 ground troops, 6,000 aviation personnel, and roughly 720 aircraft. Germany's contribution was smaller in number, but more focused in purpose. The Luftwaffe used Spain to test its dive bombers, its fighter aircraft, and its close air support tactics in live combat conditions. The Soviet Union supported the Republic. More than 30,000 foreign volunteers fought in the international brigades on the Republican side. The bombing of the Basque town of Guernica on the 26th of April 1937, carried out by German and Italian air units, became an immediate symbol of the new form of warfare: total war against civilian populations. Pablo Picasso painted it within weeks. The world was shocked. The world continued to watch from a distance. The Western democracies maintained a policy of non-intervention, partly out of fear of provoking a wider conflict, partly out of ideological ambivalence, partly because British and French conservative establishments were not entirely hostile to a nationalist Spain as a bulwark against communism. Franco won the war in April of 1939. He then declared official neutrality for Spain and remained officially neutral throughout the World War, while trading with both sides and dispatching a volunteer unit to fight alongside Germany on the Eastern Front. In Asia, the war that would eventually merge into the global conflict had been escalating for years. In July of 1937, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Peking, the exact origins of which remain a subject of historical dispute, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. Japanese forces captured Peking in late July. By August, the fighting had spread to Shanghai. By December of 1937, Japanese forces had taken Nanking, the Chinese nationalist capital, and committed what has since been documented and recognized internationally as the Nanjing Massacre. Weeks of atrocity against the civilian population and Chinese prisoners of war on a scale that shocked even German diplomatic representatives present in the city. The Japanese government denied any wrongdoing. Chinese resistance continued from the relocated capital at Chongqing. The war in China would grind on, consuming lives by the hundreds of thousands, for the entire duration of what Europe would call the Second World War. Back in Europe, 1938 was the year in which the architecture of the post-Versailles order collapsed entirely. In March of that year, German forces crossed into Austria. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich, was accomplished without resistance. The Austrian government had no outside support. The population, by most accounts, was largely in favor of unification. The Western powers protested diplomatically. Then they accepted it. Hitler then turned to Czechoslovakia, specifically to the Sudetenland, a predominantly German-speaking region along the Czech border with Germany, containing more than 3 million ethnic Germans and some of the country's most advanced industrial infrastructure. Czechoslovakia had a modern army of 38 divisions, military alliances with both France and the Soviet Union, and one of the most capable armaments industries in Central Europe. The Škoda Works. It was not defenseless, but its defensive strategy depended on the mountains of the Sudetenland. Without that territory, the country was strategically untenable. The crisis over the Sudetenland culminated in the Munich Conference of the 30th of September, 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, Mussolini, and Hitler gathered in Munich. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference at which its territory was being disposed of. The Western powers gave Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for his assurance that he had no further territorial ambitions in Europe. Chamberlain flew back to London and declared, famously, agonizingly, that he had achieved peace for our time. Within 6 months, in March of 1939, Germany occupied what remained of Czechoslovakia entirely, establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and recognizing a pro-German Slovak state. The Munich Agreement was dead. The end of the appeasement policy had arrived through its own failure. Britain and France finally abandoned it and began guaranteeing the independence of other European states. Poland in March of 1939, Romania and Greece shortly after. They accelerated their rearmament programs. Chamberlain, whatever his later reputation, had in fact overseen a substantial expansion of British air power during the period. The RAF that would fight the Battle of Britain existed partly because of decisions made during what critics call the years of appeasement. The historiographical picture is not as simple as the popular mythology suggests. The final diplomatic maneuver before the shooting started was one of the most startling of the 20th century. On the 23rd of August, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The world was stunned. Two ideological systems that had defined themselves in opposition to each other, National Socialism and Communism, had reached a political arrangement. The public text promised neutrality if either party was attacked by a third power. The secret protocol, not publicly acknowledged by the Soviet Union until 1989, divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Lithuania for Germany, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia for the Soviet Union, Poland to be partitioned between the two. With that pact signed, Germany's eastern flank was secure. The last obstacle to invasion had been removed. Hitler gave the order. The date was set. Chapter 4. The First Shot. The invasion of Poland and the phony war, September 1939 to May 1940. At 4:45 in the morning, on the 1st of September 1939, the German training battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte, near the city of Danzig. Simultaneously, German forces crossed the Polish border at multiple points, along a front stretching from Slovakia in the south to Pomerania in the north. This was not a declaration of war. There was no formal ultimatum accepted. No diplomatic protocol followed. German forces had staged a series of false flag incidents along the border, most notoriously at the Gleiwitz radio station, where SS men in Polish uniforms staged a fake attack to provide a pretext. The campaign that followed was the first demonstration of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, in its fully developed form. Coordinated armor, motorized infantry, and close air support working in rapid combination to penetrate, encircle, and destroy enemy formations before they could organize a coherent defense. The concept itself was not entirely new. Military theorists in Germany, Britain, and France had all been working on mechanized warfare doctrine through the 1930s. What Germany had done was actually implement it. The Polish army fought with genuine courage against asymmetric odds. The famous story of Polish cavalry charging German tanks, repeated for decades as a symbol of hopeless gallantry, is largely a myth, or at least a grotesque exaggeration. Polish cavalry units were modern, mounted infantry, capable of rapid movement, and they fought effectively in the early stages. What they could not overcome was the combination of German mechanized speed and, fatally, the Soviet invasion that began on the 17th of September, 1939. The Soviet Union, acting under the terms of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Protocol, invaded Poland from the east. Stalin justified the move with the claim that the Polish state had ceased to exist, and that he was protecting Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. The rationalization was transparently false. Poland was now being crushed from two directions simultaneously. Warsaw's garrison held out until the 27th of September. The last large operational unit of the Polish army surrendered on the 6th of October. Poland was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, but Poland did not surrender. This is a distinction that matters enormously to Polish historical memory, and that deserves more attention than it typically receives in Western accounts. The Polish government in exile reconstituted itself, first in Paris and then in London. A clandestine state apparatus, with its own courts, educational system, and armed resistance, functioned underground in occupied Poland for the entire duration of the war. Significant numbers of Polish military personnel evacuated through Romania and Latvia, and eventually reached France and Britain, where they continued to fight. Polish pilots would fly in the Battle of Britain. Polish forces would fight at Monte Cassino and Arnhem. Poland's contribution to the Allied war effort was substantial, and its reward in 1945 would be a bitter betrayal. But that is a later chapter. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September, 1939. 2 days after the invasion of Poland, the British ultimatum had given Germany until 11 o'clock in the morning to halt military operations and withdraw. Germany ignored it. At 11:15 that morning, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the British nation by radio. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that, unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. He paused. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. And then, for approximately 8 months, almost nothing happened on the Western Front. The period from September of 1939 to May of 1940 became known as the Phony War. In France, the Drôle de Guerre, the Strange War. The Western Allies provided no direct military support to Poland. France made a cautious, limited probe into German territory in the Saar, advancing a few kilometers, encountering minimal resistance, and then withdrawing again behind the Maginot Line. The British Expeditionary Force took up positions in northern France. Both sides appeared to be waiting. The British and French naval blockade of Germany was activated. Germany responded with U-boat warfare against Allied merchant shipping. In the Atlantic, a war of commerce and attrition began that would last until 1945. On land, the period was not entirely without incident. In November of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, the Winter War. It expected a quick victory. What it got was one of the most remarkable defensive campaigns in modern military history. Finnish forces, outnumbered in every measurable category, used their knowledge of the terrain, extreme cold, and innovative infantry tactics to inflict disproportionate casualties on the Red Army. The Soviet Union was actually expelled from the League of Nations for this act of aggression, one of the very few effective enforcement actions the organization ever took. But Finnish resistance, however extraordinary, could not hold indefinitely against a nation with a population more than 60 times larger. By March of 1940, Finland had signed a peace agreement, ceding significant territory, though it maintained its independence. The Winter War had a consequence that would prove catastrophic in scale. To Western and German military observers, the Red Army's performance in Finland appeared to confirm long-standing suspicions that Stalin's purges of the officer corps, which had removed tens of thousands of experienced military commanders from service in 1937 and 1938, had left the Soviet military incapable of effective modern warfare. The lesson would contribute, approximately 15 months later, to one of the most consequential miscalculations in military history. The phony war ended abruptly and definitively on the 9th of April, 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark capitulated in a matter of hours. Norway, despite Allied support, was overcome within 2 months. The strategic rationale was clear. German industry depended on Swedish iron ore shipments that travelled through Norwegian coastal waters during the winter months when the Gulf of Bothnia froze. The Allies had been planning to cut this route. Germany moved first. The Norwegian campaign, despite its ultimate German success, proved deeply damaging to the British government. Parliamentary debates in early May 1940, particularly a devastating speech by Leo Amery, who borrowed from Oliver Cromwell and told Chamberlain directly, "In the name of God, go," fatally undermined Chamberlain's authority. On the 10th of May 1940, Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was replaced by Winston Churchill. On the same day, Germany launched its long-awaited offensive against France and the Low Countries. The phony war was over. Chapter 5. The Fall of France. Blitzkrieg in the West, May to June 1940. When historians and strategists study the fall of France, they return to it again and again, not because it was expected, but precisely because it was not. France, in May of 1940, was not a defeated nation before the fighting started. It had the largest army in Western Europe, a modern air force, significant armoured capacity, and the Maginot Line, the most elaborate system of fixed fortifications ever constructed. Britain had committed its expeditionary force. The combined Allied order of battle in the West included more tanks than Germany possessed, and in some categories, technologically superior ones. The defeat that followed in 6 weeks was not inevitable. It was the product of a specific plan executed brilliantly against a specific failure of Allied imagination. The German plan, known as Case Yellow or Fall Gelb, in its final form shaped substantially by the thinking of General Erich von Manstein, depended on a fundamental deception about where the main blow would fall. Allied command had prepared for Germany to advance through Belgium in a manner broadly similar to the Schlieffen Plan of 1914. They were half right. Germany did advance through Belgium, but that was the decoy. The main armoured thrust, the Schwerpunkt, went through the Ardennes, a forested, hilly region along the Franco-Belgian-Luxembourg border that Allied planners had assessed as impassable for large armoured formations. It was not impassable, it was merely difficult. German armour moved through the Ardennes over several days. A column that, if stretched out, would have reached from the front to roughly 250 kilometres behind it. The risk was enormous. If Allied forces had struck the column's flanks during the crossing, the offensive could have been stopped. But Allied command was slow to recognise what was happening. By the time the armoured spearheads broke out of the Ardennes and reached the English Channel coast near Abbeville, on the 20th of May, the Allied armies in Belgium had been cut off from their supply lines and from the French forces to the south. The encirclement was nearly complete. What followed was one of the most remarkable evacuations in military history. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, which ran from the 26th of May to the 4th of June 1940. The British Admiralty had originally hoped to evacuate perhaps 45,000 men. The actual number rescued, by a combination of Royal Navy destroyers, merchant vessels, and the famous flotilla of small civilian boats that crossed the Channel, was more than 338,000 Allied soldiers, approximately 225,000 of them British. They left behind virtually all their heavy equipment, artillery, vehicles, ammunition, stores. They came home with their lives. Churchill told Parliament not to confuse a rescue with a victory, but the fact that the British Expeditionary Force survived at all, rather than being captured in its entirety, had consequences that would only become clear over the following years. On the 10th of June 1940, Italy entered the war on the side of Germany, declaring war on both France and Britain. The timing was calculated to ensure Italy could claim a share of the victory without having contributed meaningfully to it. France, already crumbling under the German onslaught, signed an armistice with Germany on the 22nd of June 1940. The ceremony was deliberately staged in the railway carriage at Compiègne, the same carriage in which Germany had signed the armistice that ended the First World War in 1918. Hitler's choreographic instinct for historical humiliation was, in its way, perfect. France was divided. The northern and western zones, including Paris, came under German military occupation. In the south, an unoccupied rump state was established with its capital at the spa town of Vichy. Under the leadership of Marshal Philippe Pétain, the Vichy regime was officially neutral, but functionally aligned with Germany. It retained the French fleet, a point of acute anxiety for Britain, which could not afford to let those ships fall into German hands. On the 3rd of July, 1940, the Royal Navy attacked the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria. French sailors died. The relationship between the two nations, already strained, was permanently poisoned at the officer class level. It was a brutal decision. Churchill made it without hesitation. General Charles de Gaulle, then a relatively junior brigadier general, who had served as an Undersecretary of State for National Defence in the last days of the French Republic, flew to London. On the 18th of June, 1940, he broadcast a message to France over the BBC, the radio address that became the founding text of the Free French movement. He had no army, no fleet, no territory, and almost no political standing. What he had was the microphone and a refusal to accept that France was finished. At that moment, almost no one in France was listening. Over the following 5 years, the legend grew around the broadcast as the French memory of the occupation became more complicated. The speed of France's collapse had an impact that reverberated far beyond Europe. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt, who had been warning since December of 1940 that Hitler intended world conquest, absorbed the fall of France as a strategic shock that accelerated American rearmament. Congress passed legislations significantly expanding the US Navy. In September of 1940, the United States agreed to a trade of 50 aging American destroyers for 99-year leases on British naval and air bases across the Caribbean and Atlantic. America remained officially neutral. Its trajectory was unmistakably shifting. In Tokyo, the speed of German victory in Western Europe produced a strategic intoxication. The colonial empires of France and the Netherlands now appeared vulnerable. French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, with their oil, rubber, and mineral resources, seemed within reach of a Japan that had been blocked in China and squeezed by American economic pressure. The Tripartite Pact, signed in late September of 1940, formally linked Japan, Italy, and Germany as the Axis powers, stipulating that any nation not already at war with any of the three that attacked one would face all three. The pact was specifically designed to deter the United States. It would not. Chapter 6. Britain alone. The Battle of Britain and the Blitz, July to May 1941. By the summer of 1940, every major nation on the European continent had either been defeated, occupied, or aligned with Germany. Britain stood alone. That phrase, Britain stood alone, has been used so frequently that it risks becoming a kind of patriotic reflex rather than a precise description of a genuinely extraordinary strategic situation. It was extraordinary. An island nation of roughly 47 million people, with an army that had just evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving its equipment on the beaches, was the sole functioning democratic power, resisting the most successful military force in Europe since Napoleon. The logical analysis, in June of 1940, suggested that Britain should negotiate. Churchill refused to negotiate. His reasons were both moral and strategic, and the two are sometimes difficult to separate. The moral case was that an accommodation with Hitler would legitimize everything Hitler had done and would do. The strategic case was that Britain, as long as it held out, kept open the possibility that the United States would eventually enter the war. And Churchill had reached the private assessment, well before it became public policy, that only American entry could ultimately defeat Germany. The combination of these judgments produced the decision to fight on, regardless of the apparent calculus. For Germany to resolve the British problem by force, it needed first to achieve air superiority over southern England, to clear the skies so that the proposed invasion, Operation Sea Lion, could proceed without the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force destroying the invasion fleet in the Channel. The task fell to the Luftwaffe under Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who told Hitler he could accomplish it in 4 weeks. The Battle of Britain began in earnest in early July of 1940, with attacks on British shipping in the Channel. In August, the Luftwaffe shifted to attacking RAF Fighter Command's airfields and radar stations, the correct strategy. What followed, through August and into September, was the most intensive air campaign ever fought over a single nation's territory up to that point in history. The RAF's Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, was under enormous strain. Pilot losses were recoverable. Britain could train replacements faster than the Luftwaffe was destroying them. But the loss of experienced flight leaders and the physical damage to the sector airfields was approaching a critical threshold. Historians have examined the operational records of August and early September of 1940 and concluded that if the Luftwaffe had maintained its focus on the airfield infrastructure for another 2 to 3 weeks, RAF Fighter Command's ability to mount coordinated resistance might have collapsed. Then, on the night of the 24th and 25th of August, German bombers accidentally dropped bombs on London, hitting civilian areas rather than their intended industrial targets. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The Berlin raid caused limited material damage, but enormous psychological and political impact. Hitler, furious and humiliated, ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its primary targets from the airfields to London. The decision to bomb London instead of the airfields was a strategic error of the First Order. From Fighter Command's perspective, the shift was salvation. It allowed damaged airfields to be repaired, exhausted squadrons to be rested, and the defensive system to recover its coherence. For London's civilian population, the shift meant the Blitz. 57 consecutive nights of bombing, beginning on the 7th of September 1940. Roughly 43,000 civilians were killed across Britain during the Blitz period. More than 1 million homes were damaged or destroyed. Yet the social and industrial fabric of Britain did not collapse. The ports kept functioning. The factories kept producing. The population did not break. The failure of the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority forced the indefinite postponement of Operation Sea Lion. By the end of October 1940, the immediate invasion threat had passed. Germany would never again seriously attempt to take Britain by force. This is one of those moments where the outcome mattered enormously for everything that followed. A conquered Britain would have removed the base from which American forces would eventually launch their return to Western Europe, would have eliminated the Atlantic convoy routes, and would have left the United States facing a hostile continent spanning German Empire without a forward ally. The strategic importance of the RAF winning the Battle of Britain cannot be measured precisely, but it was vast. Churchill's tribute to the fighter pilots, delivered in the House of Commons on the 20th of August, 1940, produced the phrase that attached itself permanently to the campaign. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Churchill was not given to empty sentiment. He understood the mathematics. Approximately 2,940 RAF aircrew fought in the Battle of Britain. Of these, roughly 544 were killed during the campaign. They included pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and more than a dozen other nations. The few were many in their origins. The naval war was also deepening through this period. German U-boats, operating from the newly captured French Atlantic ports, a strategic advantage that had not existed before the fall of France, were sinking Allied merchant shipping at a rate that threatened Britain's ability to sustain itself. Britain imported the majority of its food and virtually all of its oil. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in Churchill's later judgment, the one campaign of the war that truly frightened him, because it was the one that could have been lost quietly, without a single dramatic defeat, simply by the slow arithmetic of ships sunk against ships built. Through 1940 and into 1941, the arithmetic was dangerously close. Roosevelt's response was to push through the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, a law that allowed the United States to lend or lease war materials to any nation whose defense the president deemed vital to American security. The official neutrality fiction was becoming increasingly transparent. American destroyers were escorting convoys part of the way across the Atlantic. American naval vessels were reporting U-boat positions to the Royal Navy. In July of 1941, American forces occupied Iceland, an Allied strategic necessity given Iceland's position astride the North Atlantic convoy routes. The United States was not yet in the war, but it was no longer not in it either. By the spring of 1941, the war had spread beyond the North Atlantic and Western Europe. In North Africa, Italy had invaded British-held Egypt in September of 1940, advancing roughly 90 kilometers before halting. British counteroffensives in December had driven the Italians back across Libya, capturing more than 130,000 prisoners and reaching as far as El Agheila by early February of 1941. Italy's military performance was so poor that Germany was forced to intervene. In late March of 1941, General Erwin Rommel's newly arrived Afrika Korps launched an offensive that reversed the Allied gains within weeks and besieged the port of Tobruk. A completely separate theatre of major operations had now opened in the desert. The war was still growing. Chapter 7. Operation Barbarossa. Germany invades the Soviet Union June to December 1941. There is a moment in the planning of Operation Barbarossa that tells you almost everything you need to know about the assumptions that drove it. When German Army Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner reviewed the supply projections for the campaign, his conclusion, recorded in the operational planning documents, was that the German army would run out of fuel and ammunition at roughly the point where the campaign was expected to end victoriously. There was no logistical plan for a sustained campaign. There was no plan because the planners did not believe one would be needed. They believed the Soviet state would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. That belief, held at the highest levels of the Wehrmacht and the Nazi government, was not a military assessment based on careful analysis. It was an ideological conviction dressed in operational language. The consequences of that era were the largest single military campaign in the history of human warfare. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Germany and its Axis partners, Romania, Hungary, Italy, and Finland, launched Operation Barbarossa along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, a distance of roughly 3,000 kilometers. The invasion force numbered approximately 3 million German troops, supported by roughly 500,000 Axis allied soldiers. It was organized into three army groups. Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states to Leningrad. Army Group Center, directed toward Moscow along the historic invasion route through Minsk and Smolensk. And Army Group South, assigned to capture Ukraine and its agricultural and industrial resources, with the long-term objective of reaching the oil fields of the Caucasus. The initial weeks produced results that appeared to confirm the optimistic projections. Soviet forces were caught in positions that exposed them to immediate encirclement. The border districts of the Red Army were obliterated in days. At Minsk, at Bialystok, at Smolensk, at Kiev, German armored pincers closed around Soviet formations containing hundreds of thousands of men. The encirclement at Kiev in September of 1941 resulted in the capture of approximately 665,000 Soviet soldiers. The largest encirclement in recorded military history. The numbers were almost incomprehensible, and German high command interpreted them as evidence that victory was near. Stalin had received intelligence warnings from multiple sources, including his own agent network and the British government, which had decrypted German operational communications through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park, that Germany was preparing to attack. He had ignored them or rationalized them as provocations. His response to the opening of Barbarossa in the first days appears to have been something close to a psychological collapse. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow and was unreachable for several days. When members of the Politburo came to find him, he apparently expected to be arrested. They asked him instead to lead. He recovered, and his subsequent leadership of the Soviet war effort, brutal, often catastrophically wrong in operational terms, but possessed of an iron refusal to accept defeat, became one of the central facts of the war's outcome. The Soviet state did not collapse in 8 weeks. The question of why it did not, when every measurable indicator suggested it should, is one of the most debated questions in the historiography of the Second World War. The obvious answers include the sheer geographic scale of the Soviet Union, which absorbed German advances without reaching any single decisive point. They include the survival of sufficient industrial capacity, partly because of the extraordinary decision in the summer and autumn of 1941 to physically dismantle factories and move them by rail east of the Ural Mountains. Thousands of machines, hundreds of thousands of workers, relocated in an industrial migration that had no precedent. They include the brutal arithmetic of Soviet reserves. The USA had a population of roughly 190 million people, and it was prepared to absorb losses that no Western government could have politically survived. The German logistics system, which had been identified as a structural weakness, even in internal planning documents, began failing at exactly the rate the cautious analysts had predicted. Fuel shortages slowed the armored spearheads at critical moments. The Soviet rail gauge was wider than the European standard gauge, meaning that German supply trains could not run on captured Soviet tracks without regorging. A slow, labor-intensive process. The roads in European Russia and Ukraine, adequate in summer, turned to impassable mud in the autumn rains. The season the Russians call the Rasputitsa, the time of mud. The German army had planned for a summer campaign. It was now fighting into an autumn it had not expected, and approaching a winter for which it was not equipped. Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Moscow in October and November of 1941. German officers with binoculars could, in some accounts, see the reflected glint of the sun on the domes of the Kremlin's cathedrals. Soviet government ministries were evacuated to the city of Kuibyshev, to the east. The diplomatic corps left. Stalin stayed. Parades for the anniversary of the October Revolution were held in Moscow on the 7th of November 1941, with troops marching directly from Red Square to the front. An act of deliberate political theatre that communicated, both to the Soviet population and to the watching world, that Moscow would not fall. On the 5th and 6th of December 1941, General Georgy Zhukov launched a Soviet counter-offensive before Moscow. It had been prepared with careful operational secrecy, using fresh divisions transferred from Siberia, units equipped and trained for winter warfare, divisions that German intelligence had not known existed. The German forces, worn out without winter equipment, at the end of extended supply lines, were pushed back from Moscow in the first German strategic reversal of the war. The campaign to take Moscow before winter had failed. The 8 to 10 week victory calculations was now exposed for exactly what it had been. Germany was in a long war on the Eastern Front, against an opponent it had fatally underestimated, at the end of a 3,000-kilometer supply line. With an army that had been fighting continuously since the 1st of September 1939, the shadow that fell across the Barbarossa campaign and every subsequent operation on the Eastern Front was the ideological character of the war, as Hitler had defined it. The Wehrmacht High Command had agreed, before the invasion, to a series of directives that made the Eastern War categorically different from operations in Western Europe. The Commissar Order called for the summary execution of captured Soviet political officers. Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS killing units, followed the advancing army into the Soviet Union, with explicit orders to murder Jewish communities, communist officials, and others classified as ideological enemies. Within months of the invasion, these units had murdered hundreds of thousands of people. The Einsatzgruppen operations were not a secret within the German military system. Wehrmacht forces were at various points directly involved or complicit. The Eastern War was, from its inception, not merely a military campaign, but a campaign of organized mass murder. By December of 1941, Germany's strategic position had shifted in ways that were not yet fully visible, but were already structurally decisive. The Soviet Union had survived. Leningrad was besieged, but not taken. Its population beginning what would become a 900-day blockade of extraordinary suffering. The Wehrmacht had suffered, by its own estimates, approximately 750,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing in 6 months. German industry, which had not been placed on a genuine total war footing by December of 1941, was producing weapons and equipment at a rate substantially below what the Eastern Front required. And then, on the 7th of December, the war changed completely. Chapter 8. The Pacific Ignites. Pearl Harbor and the War Against Japan. December 1941 to mid-1942. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 has been analyzed, debated, and relitigated in American political and historical discourse for more than 80 years. The operational history is by now relatively well established. The political and intelligence failures surrounding it remain genuinely contested. What is not contested is the consequence. The United States entered the Second World War, and the nature of the conflict, until then a war that America was supporting but not formally fighting, changed permanently. The Japanese decision to attack the United States naval bases at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii was born from a strategic trap that Japan had largely constructed for itself. Japan's military expansion in Asia, in China since 1937, into French Indochina in 1940, had prompted the United States to impose progressively tighter economic restrictions. The oil embargo imposed in July of 1941, following Japan's movement into southern Indochina, was the decisive pressure point. Japan imported more than 80% of its oil from the United States. Without oil, the Japanese military machine would grind to a halt within approximately 18 months. The choice, as Japanese military planners framed it, was between accepting American diplomatic terms, which included withdrawal from China, and seizing the oil, rubber, and mineral resources of Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies by force before oil reserves ran out. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, had spent years in the United States, studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and understood American industrial capacity better than almost any other senior Japanese officer. He opposed the war with the United States on strategic grounds. His assessment, stated privately and recorded by those present, was that Japan could achieve a period of military success in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, but that American industrial capacity would eventually produce a war machine that Japan could not match. He is recorded as saying that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but that thereafter he had serious doubts. He was precisely correct. The attack on Pearl Harbor at 0755 on the 7th of December 1941 in the Hawaiian time zone was executed in 2 waves by a carrier strike force that had sailed across the North Pacific under strict radio silence. The first wave consisted of approximately 183 aircraft. The second wave followed approximately an hour later, with roughly 170 more. The assault sank or severely damaged 8 battleships, destroyed approximately 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men. By the conventional measures of a tactical strike, it was devastatingly successful. But the 3 American aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet were not at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. They were at sea. The battleships sunk in the shallow harbor were, with several exceptions, salvageable and eventually returned to service. The fuel oil storage, tanks, and repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, the logistical infrastructure that actually sustained Pacific Fleet operations, were left entirely intact. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, chose not to launch a third wave of attacks that might have struck these facilities. The decision remains debated. Yamamoto himself regarded the failure to destroy the fuel and repair infrastructure as a significant operational shortcoming. The American carriers, which were the dominant weapons platform of the Pacific War, had been missed entirely. In the hours, days, and weeks following Pearl Harbor, Japan executed a coordinated set of offensive operations across the Pacific and Southeast Asia that demonstrated extraordinary military planning capacity. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft also attacked Clark Field in the Philippines, destroying a substantial portion of the American air forces there. Japanese forces landed in Malaya and Thailand. On the 10th of December, Japanese land-based aircraft sank the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. The first time capital ships at sea, underway and able to maneuver, had been sunk solely by air attack. The age of the battleship as the supreme naval weapon was over. Every admiral in every navy on Earth understood what those 2 sinkings meant. On the 15th of February 1942, the British garrison at Singapore surrendered to Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Approximately 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian soldiers became prisoners of war, the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. The fall of Singapore was a shock that permanently altered the relationship between Britain and its Asian subjects. The myth of European imperial invincibility, which had rested on a combination of technological superiority and careful management of colonial psychology, had been catastrophically punctured. When the war ended and Indian, Malayan, Burmese, and other Asian nationalists pressed their claims for independence, the British government had less political authority and less public appetite to resist them than it had possessed in 1940. The fall of Singapore was, in the longest view, one of the events that accelerated the end of the British Empire. Japan's expansion continued through the spring of 1942 with astonishing speed. The Dutch East Indies fell in March, delivering the oil Japan needed. Burma fell in May, cutting the overland supply route to China, known as the Burma Road. American forces in the Philippines, under General Douglas MacArthur, withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula and after months of resistance, surrendered in April of 1942, resulting in the Bataan Death March, in which thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died during a forced march to prison camps under conditions deliberately designed to be lethal. MacArthur himself, ordered by President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines, departed by PT boat and subsequently by aircraft to Australia, where he made his famous promise. I shall return. The strategic turning point in the Pacific came in the first week of June 1942. At the Battle of Midway, the Japanese combined fleet, seeking to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive engagement and simultaneously seize the Midway Atoll as a forward base, sent a force centered on 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, against the American position. American signals intelligence had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to give Admiral Chester Nimitz advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions and timing. The ambush was prepared. On the 4th of June, 1942, American dive bombers from the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet found the Japanese carriers in a moment of extraordinary operational vulnerability. Their flight decks crowded with refueling and rearming aircraft, and sank all 4 Japanese fleet carriers within the space of a few hours. Japan lost at Midway what could not be quickly replaced: 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, more than 240 aircraft, and, most critically, approximately 110 experienced naval aviators who formed the core of Japan's carrier air groups. These men had trained for years. They could not be replicated in months. The United States, by contrast, had its industrial base at full mobilization. New carriers were already under construction. The balance of naval air power in the Pacific, which had favored Japan through the first 6 months of the war, shifted at Midway and never shifted back. The course of the Pacific War had been decided. Though 2.5 more years of grinding, brutal, island by island combat remained before anyone would be in a position to call it finished. Chapter 9. The Hinge. Stalingrad and North Africa, mid-1942 to early 1943-1942, was the year in which the war reached its widest geographic extent and, in the judgment of most historians, the year in which its ultimate outcome was decided. Not in a single battle, but through a series of encounters that, taken together, shifted the weight of the conflict permanently against the Axis powers. The critical engagements were separated by thousands of kilometers. In the Egyptian desert, near a railway halt called El Alamein, in the South Pacific around the island of Guadalcanal, and most decisively in the ruins of a Soviet industrial city on the Volga River that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Germany's summer offensive on the Eastern Front in 1942, designated Case Blue or Fall Blau, had a rational strategic logic that is often lost in the subsequent narrative dominated by Stalingrad. The objective was not initially to take Stalingrad at all. The primary objective was the Caucasus oil fields. Germany's oil situation was becoming critical. Romanian oil from Ploiești was insufficient. Without Soviet Caucasus oil or its denial to the Soviets, Germany's war economy faced fuel shortages that would have progressively immobilized its mechanized forces. Army Group South was split into Army Group A, directed toward the Caucasus, and Army Group B, tasked with securing the northern flank along the Volga, which happened to run through Stalingrad. The city of Stalingrad, in the summer of 1942, was a Soviet industrial center, stretched for roughly 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River. It produced tractors, and the same factory lines that produced tractors had been converted to produce tanks, which rolled off the assembly line and drove directly to the front. The city's name gave it a symbolic weight disproportionate to its purely military value. Hitler became personally fixated on its capture. Stalin ordered it held at any cost. The intersection of those two symbolic investments turned a strategic flank-securing operation into the costliest single engagement of the entire war. German forces under General Friedrich Paulus entered the city's outskirts in September of 1942. What followed was the most intense urban combat in documented military history. The Soviets, under the tactical direction of General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army, developed and refined the concept of hugging tactics, fighting at such close quarters that German artillery and air support could not be used without hitting their own forces. Every building became a fortress. Every block changed hands multiple times. A grain elevator in the southern part of the city was fought over for weeks. Factory buildings were contested room by room, floor by floor. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving as a reinforcement at the Stalingrad bridgehead, crossing the Volga under German fire, has been estimated at less than 24 hours in the most intense periods. While the battle of attrition ground through Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet planners were preparing something entirely different. Operation Uranus, the plan to encircle the entire German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, was conceived by Generals Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky in the autumn of 1942. It was designed with operational security so tight that very few people outside the planning cell knew its true scope. The plan recognized that the flanks of the German Sixth Army's salient at Stalingrad were held not by German forces but by Romanian armies, less well equipped, less well supplied, and stretched thinly across a wide frontage. On the 19th of November, 1942, Soviet armored forces struck the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. On the 20th, they struck the Romanian Fourth Army to the south. By the 23rd of November, the two pincer arms met at Kalak. The entire German Sixth Army, approximately 290,000 men, was encircled. Paulus requested permission to break out. Hitler refused. He declared Stalingrad a Festung, a fortress, and ordered the Sixth Army to hold its position, promising that supplies would be delivered by air and that a relief force would break through. Reichsmarschall Goering gave assurances that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by airlift. The operational requirements for adequate supply had been calculated at approximately 550 tons per day. The Luftwaffe achieved an average of roughly 105 tons per day at the peak of its efforts, declining through January as airfields and aircraft were lost. The arithmetic was never close. The soldiers in the Stalingrad pocket starved, froze, and fought as the relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was halted and then rolled back by Soviet forces in December. On the 31st of January, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. He had been promoted by Hitler in the final days, partly because no German field marshal had ever surrendered, capitulated with the southern portion of the pocket. 2 days later, the remaining northern groups surrendered. Approximately 91,000 survivors marched into Soviet captivity. Of those 91,000, fewer than 6,000 would eventually return to Germany, most not until years after the war ended. The fate of the German Sixth Army was known to every German family with a son or husband on the Eastern Front. It could not be entirely concealed. The myth of German invincibility which propaganda had sustained since September of 1939, was broken. In North Africa, the war had reached its own turning point by the autumn of 1942. General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, combined with Italian forces, had driven east through Libya and into Egypt, reaching the El Alamein position, approximately 106 kilometers west of Alexandria, in the summer of 1942. It was the closest Axis forces came to the Suez Canal, the strategic artery that connected Britain to its Indian Empire and to the oil of the Persian Gulf. At El Alamein, the front was anchored on both sides by impassable terrain. The Mediterranean coast to the north, the Qattara Depression, a vast salt-encrusted depression that could not support armored vehicles. To the south, there was no open desert flank to exploit. The Afrika Korps had reached a position that could be held, but not bypassed. General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed to command the British Eighth Army, methodically rebuilt his forces' supply position and morale through August and September of 1942, while Rommel's command suffered from fuel shortages so acute that his armor was immobilized for significant periods. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which opened on the 20th of October 1942, was a set-piece battle fought with material superiority that Montgomery had carefully accumulated. More than 1,000 tanks against Rommel's approximately 530, many of which were the lighter Italian models. The battle lasted 12 days. On the 4th of November, the Axis line broke and the retreat began. A retreat that would continue, with pauses, all the way to Tunisia. On the 8th of November, 1942, 4 days after El Alamein, Anglo-American forces landed in French North Africa, in Morocco and Algeria, in Operation Torch. This was the first major American ground offensive operation in the European theatre, and it established the Joint Command structure under General Dwight D. Eisenhower that would manage the Allied campaign in the Mediterranean and, eventually, Northwest Europe. Axis forces in North Africa were now caught between the Eighth Army, advancing from the east, and the Allied forces pressing from the west. By May of 1943, the last Axis position in North Africa had surrendered, yielding approximately 250,000 prisoners. The southern Mediterranean was effectively cleared. The next step toward Europe was visible. Chapter 10, The Eastern Colossus Kursk, the Soviet Counteroffensive, and the War in the Air, 1943. 1943 on the Eastern Front opened with the Soviet military in a position of growing confidence, and the German military in a state of complex denial. The loss at Stalingrad had been absorbed, explained, and in Hitler's internal narrative attributed to the failures of allies and subordinates, rather than to any structural flaw in German strategy. The Wehrmacht was still a formidably capable organization, capable of local counter-offensives and tactical brilliance. In February and March of 1943, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein executed a successful counterstroke in Ukraine that recaptured Kharkov and temporarily stabilized the southern part of the Eastern Front after the Stalingrad disaster. It was a display of operational art that confirmed the Wehrmacht's continuing tactical capacity. But it was a defense, not an advance. The strategic initiative was shifting. The German summer offensive plan for 1943, Operation Citadel, was intended to restore the initiative. The Kursk salient was a large westward bulge in the front line, centered on the city of Kursk, that had been created by the fluid fighting of the winter. German planning called for a double pincer attack. Army Group Center from the north, Army Group South from the south, to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces within the salient, producing a battlefield victory large enough to restore confidence in German military power, and to demonstrate to the watching world that the Stalingrad catastrophe had been an aberration. On paper, the plan had a certain logic. In practice, it had a fatal flaw. The Soviets knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence fed by the rote Capel agent networks operating in Western Europe, and by what British sources have described as intelligence from the ultra-decryption program, gave Soviet command comprehensive advanced knowledge of Operation Citadel. Zhukov's recommendation to Stalin, accepted, was to conduct a strategic defense in depth, allow the German offensive to exhaust itself, and then counterattack. Soviet engineers constructed between 5 and 8 defensive belts within the salient, stretching to depths of up to 300 kilometers. Approximately 1.3 million anti-tank mines were laid. More than 3,300 kilometers of trenches were dug. The Kursk salient became the most heavily fortified position in military history to that point. The German offensive was delayed multiple times, partly because Hitler wanted to wait for the new generation of heavy tanks, particularly the Panther and the Ferdinand, to be available in sufficient numbers. Each delay gave Soviet engineers more time to deepen the fortifications. Operation Citadel finally began on the 5th of July, 1943. In the north, Army Group Center's attack ran into the Soviet defensive belts and made limited progress at significant cost. In the south, the SS Panzer Corps under General Paul Hauser made deeper penetrations, fighting its way through the successive defensive lines. On the 12th of July, near the village of Prokhorovka, one of the largest tank engagements of the entire war took place. Approximately 600 German armored vehicles against roughly 800 Soviet, in a battle whose exact character and outcome historians have debated in detail. The simpler narrative of a decisive Soviet victory at Prokhorovka has been qualified by research suggesting German losses were actually lower than Soviet losses on that specific day. What ended Citadel was not any single engagement, but the aggregate failure of the offensive to achieve the required penetration before reserves were exhausted. On the same day as Prokhorovka, the 12th of July, Soviet forces launched a counter-offensive north of Kursk against the flank of Army Group Center. On the 13th of July, Hitler summoned Manstein and the Northern Army Group commander to inform them that Citadel was being suspended. Allied landings in Sicily, which had begun on the 9th of July, required the transfer of forces from the east to Italy. The German summer offensive of 1943 was over. It had achieved none of its objectives and had consumed irreplaceable armored forces and aviation assets. The Soviet counteroffensive that followed through the summer and autumn of 1943 would liberate Orel, Kharkov, and ultimately Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, which was retaken on the 6th of November 1943. The momentum of the Eastern Front had permanently reversed. The war in the air in 1943 was being fought on multiple axes simultaneously, and it matters enormously to the overall story, because air power was becoming the decisive force multiplier of the industrial age. In the skies over Germany, the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces were conducting the strategic bombing campaign that Churchill and Roosevelt had committed to at the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943. The combined bomber offensive, whose stated aim was the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people. The RAF Bomber Command, under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, conducted primarily area bombing at night. Large formations of heavy bombers targeting German industrial cities. The American 8th Air Force conducted daylight precision bombing against specific industrial targets: oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, aircraft production facilities. The theory was sound. The practice was extraordinarily costly in the early period. American bombers flying without fighter escort deep into German-held territory, because no fighter aircraft had the range to accompany them, suffered losses that were approaching the operationally unsustainable. The Schweinfurt raids of August and October of 1943 targeting ball-bearing production, resulted in the loss of roughly 60 American bombers on the second raid alone, approximately 600 airmen in a single day. American precision daylight bombing was temporarily suspended over German territory. The crisis was resolved, partially, by the introduction of the North American P-51 Mustang in operational numbers beginning in late 1943 and through 1944. The Mustang, fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Its introduction into the long-range escort role, combined with the aggressive tactical decision to free the fighter escorts to hunt German interceptors rather than tightly escort their bombers, began the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter force. The Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots at a rate that Germany's training program could not replace. By the spring of 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was becoming comprehensive. The skies over Normandy, when the time came, would be controlled by the Allies. In the submarine war in the Atlantic, 1943 brought a decisive turn that is sometimes treated as secondary to the land battles, but was arguably as strategically important as Stalingrad. The German U-boat campaign had reached its peak effectiveness in late 1942 and early 1943. In March of 1943, U-boats sank approximately 627,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month. The monthly rate that, if sustained, would have made it mathematically impossible for Britain to continue importing sufficient food and materials. But the Allied anti-submarine response had been intensifying. New escort carriers closed the mid-Atlantic air gap that U-boats had exploited, improved radar technology, made surface travel at night dangerous, and high-frequency direction-finding equipment allowed convoy escorts to locate and attack U-boats that used radio. In May of 1943, the losses among U-boat crews became so severe that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. The crisis had passed. Britain would not be strangled by sea. The Italian campaign opened in July of 1943 with the Allied invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky, and within days had produced an unexpected political consequence. On the 25th of July, the fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. The King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, had him arrested as he left a royal audience. The man who had marched on Rome in 1922, who had invaded Ethiopia and declared a new Roman Empire, who had dragged Italy into the war on Hitler's coattails, was driven away in an ambulance and imprisoned. Italy and Germany were now strategic adversaries as much as they were nominal allies. Italy signed an armistice with the Allies on the 3rd of September and announced it publicly on the 8th. The Germans, who had prepared for exactly this scenario, immediately disarmed Italian forces, occupied northern and central Italy, and established a defensive line that would make the Italian campaign one of the costliest and most grinding Allied operations of the war. Chapter 11. The Beginning of the End. D-Day and the Liberation of Western Europe, 1944. The planning for the Allied invasion of Northwest Europe, the operation that became known as Overlord, consumed more intellectual and organizational energy than perhaps any military operation in history. The scale of the logistical challenge was without precedent. An army of sufficient size to break through the German Atlantic Wall defenses, sustain itself in the subsequent breakout battle, and advance to the Rhine River required not merely the accumulation of men and material on the southern coast of England. More than 1,500,000 American soldiers alone were stationed in Britain by the spring of 1944. But the solution of problems that had never been solved before. How do you land an army on a fortified coast without a port? How do you supply it once it's ashore? How do you protect it from the Luftwaffe? Each question had an answer. and the answers together constituted one of the most sophisticated joint military operations ever conceived. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower selected the 5th of June, 1944, as the target date for Operation Overlord. Contingent on weather, the meteorological conditions required were specific and narrow. A particular phase of the moon for nighttime airborne operations, a specific tidal state at low tide rising for the beach assault, and acceptable sea conditions for the naval armada. On the 4th of June, Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, briefed the commanders that conditions on the 5th would be unacceptable. High winds and low cloud would prevent effective air support and scatter the airborne forces. Eisenhower postponed by 24 hours. On the evening of the 4th, Stagg returned with a forecast of a narrow window of acceptable weather beginning on the 6th. Eisenhower made the decision alone. Okay, let's go. The 6th of June 1944 began in the dark. Shortly after midnight, two American airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, and one British airborne division, the 6th, descended by parachute and glider onto the flanks of the landing zone to secure critical bridges and exits. Navigation in the dark was imprecise. Units were scattered across areas far wider than planned. Some men landed in flooded marshes and drowned, weighed down by their equipment. Others landed miles from their objectives. Yet the aggregate effect, the creation of a confused, widespread airborne presence behind the German lines, delayed and disoriented the German response in the critical early hours. At 0630, the first landing craft touched down on the beaches. The code names have become so familiar that they risk losing their original function as operational designations and becoming instead something like postal addresses of tragedy and courage. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Utah, where the American 4th Infantry Division landed, went more smoothly than almost any planner had dared hope. A navigational error during the approach had actually put the landing craft down on a less heavily defended stretch of beach. Omaha was catastrophic. The American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions landed in sectors where German defensive positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach remained intact. The pre-landing bombardment had been largely ineffective. Soldiers leaving the landing craft faced withering fire with nowhere to shelter. Casualties in the first 2 hours were staggering. That American soldiers got off Omaha Beach at all is the result of individual acts of initiative and courage by small unit leaders. Sergeants and lieutenants and captains who recognized that remaining at the waterline meant certain death and led their men up the bluffs in improvised groups, cutting through the barbed wire, flanking the German firing positions, paying for each meter with casualties. By nightfall, the beachhead existed. It was shallow, precarious, and at several points had nearly been pushed back into the sea, but it held. All 5 beaches had been taken. The Allied foothold in northwest Europe was established. The German response on the 6th of June was shaped by a command structure paralyzed by its own decision-making arrangements, and by the success of Allied deception operations. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception plan using false radio traffic, inflatable dummy tanks, and carefully managed agent intelligence, had convinced significant portions of German intelligence that the main Allied landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Even as the actual landings were in progress, Hitler and several senior commanders remained uncertain whether Normandy was the real invasion or a feint. The panzer divisions that could have counterattacked effectively on the 6th were held back, waiting for the real invasion that never came. By the time German command recognized that Normandy was the primary effort, the window for a decisive beach counterattack had passed. The campaign in Normandy that followed was not the clean liberation of popular imagination. It was a brutal, attritional slogging match through the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, where every field boundary was a defensive position, where tanks were ambushed by infantry at close range, and where the Germans made the Allies pay for every kilometre in blood. The British and Canadian sectors around Caen saw fighting of extraordinary intensity through June and July, as German armoured forces were drawn to the British sector to prevent the loss of the city and the roads leading south. This served the overall Allied plan by holding German armour away from the American sector in the west, where General George Patton's Third Army was preparing for what would become the breakout. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy pocket, began on the 25th of July 1944, preceded by the heaviest saturation bombing of an area close to friendly front lines yet attempted, a bombardment that, tragically, killed approximately 111 American soldiers through short bombing before it was done. When the ground forces moved through the gap created, the German defensive line crumbled. Within days, American armor was pouring through into open country. By early August, Patton's Third Army was moving through Brittany and then southeast at speeds that echoed the German advances of 1940. On the 25th of August, Free French forces, deliberately chosen by Eisenhower to lead the entry, liberated Paris. General de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées. The liberation of Paris has a powerful symbolism that sometimes obscures the operational picture. The war in Western Europe was far from over. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortifications, had to be breached. The Allied logistical system, which had been functioning brilliantly through the breakout, was running out of fuel. The advance slowed as the supply lines stretched. In September, the airborne operation at Arnhem, Market Garden, the plan to capture bridges over the Rhine and bypass the Siegfried Line, ended in a British airborne division being surrounded and largely destroyed at Arnhem, when German forces proved stronger and more coherent than intelligence had indicated. The Rhine crossing that Market Garden was meant to achieve would have to wait until spring. In December of 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the west. Operation Watch on the Rhine, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, striking through the Ardennes in poor weather that grounded Allied air power. German armour drove a salient roughly 8 kilometres deep by 96 kilometres wide into the American line. The initial German advance captured supply depots and threatened the critical road junction at Bastogne. The American 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, refused surrender demands with a single-word response attributed to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. Nuts. German fuel shortages. The tanks were running on captured American fuel by this point, and the return of good flying weather allowed Allied air power to resume operations. The salient was reduced through January of 1945. Germany had spent its light offensive reserves in the West. Chapter 12. The Holocaust. The Machinery of Murder, 1941 to 1945. There are chapters in this documentary that require a different kind of attention. This is one of them. We are not going to step around what happened. We are going to look at it directly, with the precision the historical record demands, and with the seriousness that the scale of the crime requires. The Holocaust, the systematic state-organized murder of approximately 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, including Roma, disabled people, Soviet civilians, Polish intellectuals, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexual men and political opponents, was not a side event of the Second World War. It was inseparable from it. The war created the conditions, the geographic reach, and the institutional cover under which the murder was organized and executed. Understanding the Holocaust is not optional for anyone who claims to understand the Second World War. The persecution of Jewish people in Germany began immediately after Hitler came to power in 1933, with legal discrimination enshrined in the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped German Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews. By 1938, the policy had escalated to organized violence. The Kristallnacht pogrom of the 9th and 10th of November 1938, in which Jewish synagogues, businesses, and homes were attacked across Germany and Austria. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, and the German government imposed a collective fine on the Jewish community for the property damage caused by the pogrom conducted against them. The purpose was to make Jewish life in Germany so unbearable that Jews would emigrate. Many did. Many others could not find countries willing to accept them. The Evian Conference of July 1938, convened at Franklin Roosevelt's initiative to address the refugee crisis, produced commitments from 32 nations to discuss the problem and practical assistance from very few of them. The Dominican Republic offered to accept 100,000 Jewish refugees. Most other nations, including the United States and Britain, declined to significantly expand their immigration quotas. The conference confirmed for the Nazi government that the world was unwilling to take in the people it was expelling, a fact that the Nazi propaganda apparatus exploited with transparent cynicism. The failure at Evian does not create moral equivalence between democratic governments and the Nazi regime, but it does complicate any uncritical narrative of the Allied powers as the unequivocal defenders of Jewish life. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 marked a qualitative transformation in anti-Jewish policy. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units of the SS, backed by order police battalions, and in many locations by local collaborators, followed the advancing army into the newly occupied territories and began the systematic mass murder of Jewish communities. The largest single documented operation of this kind was the Babi Yar massacre of the 29th and 30th of September 1941 at a ravine outside Kyiv, where more than 33,771 Jewish people were killed in 2 days. The shootings in the occupied East killed approximately 1,500,000 Jewish people between June of 1941 and the end of the year. The Wannsee Conference of the 20th of January 1942 did not decide to kill the Jews of Europe. That decision had already been made, or evolved through policy and practice. What the Wannsee Conference did was coordinate the bureaucratic machinery across multiple German government ministries and SS organs to implement what the participants called the final solution of the Jewish question: the organized deportation of Jews from across occupied Europe to facilities in occupied Poland, equipped specifically for mass murder. Senior SS official Reinhard Heydrich chaired the meeting. Adolf Eichmann took the minutes. The document that resulted, preserved and used as evidence at Nuremberg, is one of the most chilling bureaucratic records in human history. The mass murder of millions described in administrative language as a logistics and transportation problem. The killing centers established in occupied Poland: Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, operated with the systematic efficiency of industrial processes. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest, was both a concentration camp for forced labor and an extermination center. Deportees arriving by train were subjected to a selection process on the platform. Those assessed as fit for labor were registered and entered the camp system. Those not selected, the elderly, children, the ill, most women with young children, were taken directly to the gas chambers and murdered within hours of arrival. The majority of those killed at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The total number has been established by the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum at approximately 1,100,000. Died in this way, within hours of their arrival, their names never recorded in any camp register. The deportations drew on the rail infrastructure of occupied Europe and the administrative cooperation of governments across the continent. In France, the Vichy government organized and participated in the deportation of both foreign-born and French-born Jews. In the Netherlands, a high proportion of the Jewish population, more than 75%, was murdered, a death rate significantly higher than in Belgium or France, partly because of the efficiency of Dutch administrative records and the particular character of the German occupation authority. In Denmark, by contrast, the Danish population organized a remarkable overnight rescue in October of 1943, ferrying approximately 7,000 Jewish Danish citizens across the Øresund straight to neutral Sweden in fishing boats when the German deportation order was issued. The rescue has become a documented example of what collective moral courage could achieve, even under occupation. The physical scale of the murder is almost impossible to apprehend through statistics alone. The historian Raoul Hilberg, in his foundational work, The Destruction of the European Jews, approached the question through the documentary record, the administrative files, the transport orders, the census data, the testimony of survivors, and produced an analysis that is still the structural foundation of Holocaust scholarship. The total number of Jewish victims established by serious historical research is approximately 6 million, representing roughly 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe. Entire communities that had existed for centuries, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Hungary, in Greece, were effectively eliminated. The Yiddish-speaking world of Eastern Europe, with its millennia of accumulated culture, scholarship, and community life, was largely destroyed. The Allied governments knew during the war that systematic mass murder was occurring. The question of what they knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge is one of the most contested and morally charged areas of Second World War historiography. The British government had decrypted police and SS communications from the eastern occupied territories describing mass shootings from the summer of 1941. The World Jewish Congress provided documentation to Allied governments from the summer of 1942, describing the systematic extermination program. The New York Times reported on it, though not always prominently. Allied bomber fleets flew within operational range of Auschwitz-Birkenau in the summer of 1944, when the deportation of Hungarian Jews was at its peak rate. The decision not to bomb the rail lines or the crematorium buildings, which was requested by Jewish organizations, was made, and the reasons given have been debated by historians ever since. The debate has not been fully resolved. The liberation of the camps began in the last months of the war. Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau on the 27th of January, 1945. British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April, where they found approximately 13,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 surviving prisoners, many dying of typhus and starvation. American forces liberated Dachau, Buchenwald, and other camps through April and May of 1945. American General Dwight Eisenhower, visiting the Ohrdruf camp on the 12th of April, 1945, ordered every nearby American soldier and German civilian to tour it. He wrote to General George Marshall, "I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." He understood, even in that moment, that this was the kind of thing people would later try not to believe. Chapter 13. The Collapse of the Third Reich. The Fall of Germany, January to May 1945. By the first day of January 1945, Germany was losing the war on every front simultaneously, and the mathematics of its situation were beyond the reach of any strategy or any individual will to reverse. The Wehrmacht was fighting the Soviet Union across a front stretching from the Baltic coast to the Danube, fighting the Anglo-American forces in the west along the Rhine, fighting a grinding defensive campaign in Italy, and doing all of this with an army that was being rebuilt from the wreckage of the Battle of the Bulge, resupplied through a rail and road network that Allied strategic bombing was progressively dismantling, and fed through an agricultural economy that had been stripped nearly bare. German soldiers in the last months of the war were frequently issued ammunition before food. The civilian population of Germany's cities was living under a bombed sky, in basements and rubble, surviving on rations that the Reich's nutrition economists had already calculated were below sustainable levels. The war was lost. Adolf Hitler knew the war was lost. He refused to stop it. Hitler's refusal to seek terms, his determination to fight to the last German, was rooted in a worldview that had no category for political survival through negotiation. His ideology held that a Germany that could not win was a Germany that deserved to be destroyed. He said as much in the final months, in conferences and in the document historians call the Nero Decree of the 19th of March, 1945, which ordered the destruction of all German industrial infrastructure rather than allow it to fall into Allied hands. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, systematically failed to implement it, understanding that a post-war German population needed infrastructure to survive. The decree was one of several signs that Hitler had stopped thinking about Germany as a nation of living people, and had begun thinking about it as a stage set for a concluding historical drama in which his own death was the final act. The Soviet winter offensive of January 1945. Operation Vistula Oder was one of the largest military operations in history. On the 12th of January, Soviet forces under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev struck the German lines in Poland with a force of more than 2 million men, 37,000 artillery pieces, and approximately 7,200 tanks. The German front, which had been stripped of reserves to feed the Ardennes offensive in the west, collapsed within days. By the end of January, Soviet forces had crossed the Oder River and stood approximately 60 kilometers from Berlin. The speed of the advance drove approximately 12 million German civilians and ethnic Germans in East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania into desperate westward flight in the dead of winter. One of the largest forced population movements in European history, conducted under conditions of extreme cold, starvation, and violence. The human suffering of that flight has no adequate language. In the West, Anglo-American forces crossed the Rhine in force in March of 1945. The Remagen Bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, was captured intact on the 7th of March, when a unit of the American 9th Armored Division reached it before German engineers could complete its demolition. The bridge was damaged but crossable, and American forces poured across it before it finally collapsed 10 days later. Other crossings followed rapidly. Patton's Third Army crossed at Oppenheim on the night of the 22nd of March, with so little resistance that Patton reportedly waded into the Rhine himself to urinate in it, a gesture that captured both the man and the moment more precisely than any formal summary could. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, was encircled by late March, trapping Army Group B and approximately 317,000 German soldiers in what the Americans called the Ruhr Pocket. By mid-April, the pocket had surrendered. American and British forces raced east across Germany through April of 1945, at speeds that reflected the near-total collapse of organized German resistance in the West. Units of the American First Army reached the Elbe River on the 11th of April and made contact with Soviet forces at Torgau on the 25th of April. The famous meeting at the Elbe, photographed and broadcast as a symbol of Allied unity. The decision not to advance to Berlin, which General Eisenhower had communicated directly to Stalin in late March, was made on military and political grounds. Berlin was within the Soviet occupation zone as agreed at Yalta, would cost substantial American casualties to take, and offered no strategic advantage worth those casualties, since the occupation boundary had already been determined. The decision was controversial among American military leaders, particularly General Patton, but it reflected Eisenhower's understanding that his authority was military, not political. The battle for Berlin itself, the Soviet operation to take the city, was fought between the 16th of April and the 2nd of May, 1945, and it was the largest urban battle of the entire war. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front and Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front drove into a city defended by a mixture of regular army units, SS formations, Volkssturm, the last-ditch civilian militia composed of boys and elderly men, and whatever fragments of experienced formations could be assembled. The fighting was building by building, floor by floor, following the patterns of urban warfare that Stalingrad had defined 2.5 years earlier. German defenders, knowing the ideological character of the war they had conducted in the East, knew what Soviet occupation would mean, and fought with the desperation of men who had no acceptable alternative. Soviet losses in the Berlin operation were enormous. Approximately 80,000 killed in approximately 3 weeks. And the human cost to the city's surviving civilian population, particularly women, was appalling in ways that Soviet historical writing suppressed for decades, and that have been fully acknowledged only through post-Soviet archival research. In the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, Hitler spent the last weeks of his life in a physical and psychological condition that his inner circle found increasingly alarming. His hands trembled. He raged at generals who were commanding armies that no longer existed in any meaningful strength. He awarded decorations. He moved flags on maps. On the 29th of April, 1945, he dictated his political testament, blaming the Jews for the war, as he had always blamed them, and married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. On the 30th of April, 1945, with Soviet forces approximately 300 to 400 meters from the bunker entrance, Adolf Hitler took his own life. Eva Braun died alongside him. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden, following Hitler's explicit instructions that he not be put on display as Mussolini had been. Mussolini had been captured by Italian partisans on the 28th of April, executed, and his body hung upside down in a Milan piazza. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, designated by Hitler as his successor in the final testament, attempted briefly to continue governing from Flensburg in the north, while negotiating a partial surrender that would allow German forces to escape Soviet capture in the east. The idea was to surrender to the Western Allies, while buying time to move troops and refugees westward. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed Germany's unconditional surrender on the 8th of May, 1945, at Soviet military headquarters in Berlin-Karlshorst. The Western Allies celebrated Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, on the 8th of May. The Soviet Union, because the surrender signing in Karlshorst was completed after midnight Moscow time, celebrates on the 9th of May. That calendrical difference between the Western and Eastern commemorations of the same event has been, in its way, a small, persistent symbol of the fracture that was already forming between the wartime allies, even as they celebrated their common victory. The scale of destruction across Europe at the moment of Germany's surrender defied any rapid accounting. Warsaw had been systematically demolished by German forces after the Warsaw Rising of 1944. Roughly 85% of the city's buildings had been destroyed by deliberate demolition. After the Rising suppression, Leningrad had survived 872 days of siege, from the 8th of September 1941 to the 27th of January 1944, during which approximately 800,000 civilians died, primarily from starvation. The cities of the Ruhr were rubble. Dresden, bombed by the RAF and then the USAF in February of 1945, in a raid whose necessity and proportionality have been debated by historians ever since, lay in ruins. The total number of Soviet citizens killed during the war, military and civilian, is estimated by Russian and post-Soviet scholarship at approximately 27 million. These numbers resist comprehension. They must be attempted anyway. The Nuremberg trials, which opened on the 20th of November 1945, put the surviving senior figures of the Nazi regime on trial before an international military tribunal for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, the last category being largely a new legal concept, developed specifically to describe what the Nazi regime had done, for which no adequate existing legal framework existed. 22 defendants stood trial in the principal proceedings. 12 were sentenced to death, 7 to prison terms, and 3 were acquitted. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, sentenced to death, avoided the hangman by concealing a cyanide capsule and taking it the night before his scheduled execution. The trials established the principle that individuals in government service could be held personally criminally accountable for the policies of the state they served, a principle that imperfectly and inconsistently has shaped international law from Nuremberg to the present day. Chapter 14. The Pacific Endgame, Island Hopping, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Road to Japan, 1943 to 1945. The Pacific War in its middle and later phases had a geographic and operational character so different from the European theatre that the two campaigns are sometimes difficult to hold in the mind simultaneously as parts of a single conflict. In Europe, armies fought across land masses on which every feature, city, river, mountain range, road junction, had centuries of human meaning attached to it. In the Pacific, armies fought for islands, many of which had no names in any language before the war assigned them permanent ones. Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, places that the men who died on them had never heard of before they were ordered to take them, and that the world remembers now only because of what it cost to capture them. The logic of the Pacific War was the logic of distance, of closing the enormous maritime space between the American industrial base and the Japanese home islands. Step by step, island by island, under skies that were increasingly controlled by American air power, and across seas that were increasingly controlled by American submarines cutting Japan's supply lines to the oil and raw materials of Southeast Asia. The strategic debate over how to approach Japan dominated American Pacific Command throughout 1943 and much of 1944. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding in the Southwest Pacific, advocated an approach through New Guinea and the Philippines, partly for genuinely strategic reasons, and partly because he had promised the Filipino people he would return, and he intended to keep that promise regardless of its operational cost. Admiral Chester Nimitz and the Naval Command advocated the Central Pacific route, a drive through the Mariana Islands, which would place the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, in a solution characteristic of American civil-military relations under wartime pressure, approved both axes of advance simultaneously. Both campaigns proceeded in parallel, each consuming resources and drawing Japanese forces, until they converged in the Philippines in late 1944. The island hopping campaign, more precisely described in the operational documents as leapfrogging, involved selecting specific islands for assault while deliberately bypassing others, leaving Japanese garrisons isolated and unable to influence events, to be neutralized by air and sea blockade rather than costly ground assault. The technique was applied with greatest effect in the campaign to retake the Philippines and advance through the Central Pacific. Tarawa in November of 1943 was an early demonstration of the cost when amphibious assault was conducted without sufficient preparatory fires and with inadequate intelligence about the tidal conditions. Approximately 1,000 American Marines and sailors were killed in 76 hours of fighting on an atoll that could be crossed on foot in minutes. The lessons of Tarawa, absorbed in detail, shaped every subsequent amphibious operation in the Pacific. The Mariana Islands campaign of June and July of 1944 delivered both a strategic base for the B-29 campaign against Japan and the destruction of Japanese naval air power in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on the 19th and 20th of June, 1944. American carrier-based fighters so thoroughly dismantled the attacking Japanese carrier air groups that American aviators nicknamed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost approximately 395 carrier aircraft to approximately 29 American. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air groups, already thin since Midway, were now reduced to shadows of their former capability. The carriers that remained existed without the trained aviators to make them effective. After the Philippine Sea, the Japanese fleet was no longer able to project meaningful air power from carriers. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, fought to contest the American invasion of the Philippines, was the largest naval battle in history by the number of ships involved. Over 290 warships on both sides. Japan employed a complex, multi-pronged plan involving deliberate sacrifice of its remaining carriers as decoys, while the main surface force attempted to reach and destroy the American landing fleet. The plan nearly succeeded in one sector, the Japanese center force, which had fought through the Sibuyan Sea under murderous air attack, surprised and overwhelmed a force of American escort carriers and destroyers off Samar. The American ships, vastly outgunned, fought with such aggressive determination, destroyers attacking Japanese battleships at close range, that the Japanese commander concluded he was engaging fleet carriers with destroyer escorts, and withdrew before completing the destruction. The Battle of Leyte Gulf cost Japan 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, along with the last coherent operational capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan still had ships. It no longer had a fleet. Iwo Jima, assaulted on the 19th of February 1945, was the island that distilled the character of the Pacific Ground War into its most concentrated form. The island is roughly 8 square kilometers of volcanic rock and ash, dominated by the extinct volcano Mount Suribachi at its southern end. It had been fortified with approximately 22 kilometers of tunnels, hundreds of concrete bunkers, and a garrison of approximately 22,000 Japanese soldiers under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who had ordered his men not to die in the traditional banzai charges, but to fight from concealed positions, making the Americans pay for every meter. The preliminary naval and air bombardment lasted 74 days. When the Marines landed, the Japanese defenders had been driven underground into the tunnel network and were mostly unharmed. The fighting lasted 36 days. Approximately 6,800 Marines were killed, and nearly 20,000 wounded. Of the roughly 22,000 Japanese defenders, only approximately 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died. The famous photograph of 6 Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi on the 23rd of February was taken during fighting that continued for another month. The image became one of the most reproduced photographs in American history. Okinawa, a Solad, assaulted on the 1st of April, 1945, Easter Sunday, was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, involving approximately 183,000 American ground troops, supported by the largest naval force yet assembled in the Pacific. The campaign lasted 82 days, until the 22nd of June, 1945. Approximately 12,000 American servicemen were killed and 36,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison of approximately 110,000 soldiers fought essentially to the last man. The civilian population of Okinawa, approximately 150,000 people, was caught in the battle, subjected to Japanese pressure to resist or die rather than surrender, and suffered catastrophic casualties. The combined military and civilian death toll on Okinawa has been estimated at between 150,000 and 200,000. The casualty figures from Okinawa were the primary data point that American military planners used when estimating the cost of invading the Japanese home islands. The operation designated Downfall, with a preliminary landing on Kyushu planned for November of 1945. The estimates for Operation Downfall, prepared by the American Joint Chiefs of Staff in the summer of 1945, projected American casualties of somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million. The precise number varies significantly depending on the assumptions built into each study and has been debated in detail by historians. Japanese military planners had prepared Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the home islands, which included approximately 10,000 kamikaze aircraft, thousands of suicide boats, and the arming of the civilian population. The human cost projected on both sides was of a magnitude that shaped every subsequent decision made by the Truman administration through the summer of 1945. Against that projected cost, the decision about the atomic bomb was made. The strategic bombing of Japan by B-29 superfortresses operating from the Mariana bases had been underway since November of 1944. Initial high-altitude precision bombing produced limited results because the jet stream winds over Japan scattered the formations and degraded bombing accuracy. General Curtis LeMay restructured the campaign in March of 1945, switching to low-altitude night incendiary raids against Japanese cities, which were predominantly constructed of wood and paper. The raid on Tokyo on the night of the 9th and 10th of March, 1945, used approximately 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs and created a firestorm that destroyed roughly 41 square kilometers of the city and killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bombing that followed. By August of 1945, more than 60 Japanese cities had been substantially destroyed by conventional bombing. Japan had lost its air force defending against these raids and could no longer effectively contest the bombers. It continued to refuse unconditional surrender. The submarine campaign that ran simultaneously with the air campaign has received less historical attention than the naval battles and the island assaults. But its contribution to Japan's defeat may have been equal to any other single factor. American submarines, attacking Japanese merchant shipping throughout the Pacific, had by mid-1945 reduced Japan's merchant fleet to a fraction of its pre-war size. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies had virtually ceased. Japan's refineries were running on reserve stocks. Its military aviation was rationing fuel. Its surface navy sat in harbour because it could not go to sea. The industrial machine that had sustained Japanese expansion since 1937 was being strangled. Not in a single dramatic battle, but through the patient arithmetic of submarines and sea lanes. Japan in the summer of 1945 was an economy approaching total systemic failure, still governed by men who believed that surrender was a worse fate than annihilation. Chapter 15. The Bomb and the Surrender. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the End of the War, August 1945. The decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan is the most debated single decision of the Second World War, and possibly of the 20th century. It is a decision that has never stopped generating argument among historians, among ethicists, among the populations of the nations involved, among the descendants of those who died, because it sits at the intersection of military necessity, political calculation, technological transformation, and fundamental questions about the moral limits of warfare that were already present in the firebombing campaigns, and the U-boat blockades, and the aerial bombing of civilian cities, but that the atomic bomb posed with a new and permanent intensity. We will not resolve that debate here. We will present what happened and what we know of why, with the precision the subject demands. The Manhattan Project, the American, British, and Canadian scientific and industrial program to develop an atomic weapon, had begun in earnest in 1942, drawing partly on the theoretical foundation laid by the international community of physicists who had been working on nuclear fission since the late 1930s, and partly on the impetus provided by the fear, never fulfilled, that Germany was pursuing its own atomic program. The project eventually employed more than 130,000 people across 30 research and production sites across the United States and Canada, at a total cost of roughly $2 billion in 1945 values. The theoretical and engineering challenge of building a weapon using nuclear fission was solved at multiple sites. Uranium enrichment at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, plutonium production at Hanford, Washington, weapon design and assembly at Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer. The first successful test detonation, the Trinity test at Alamogordo, New Mexico, occurred on the 16th of July, 1945. The yield was equivalent to approximately 21 kilotons of conventional explosive. Those present at the test, by multiple accounts, stood in silence for a moment before the technical assessments began. President Harry S. Truman had been informed of the Manhattan Project only after Roosevelt's death on the 12th of April, 1945. He received detailed briefings and, at the Potsdam Conference in July, was informed of the Trinity test result. At Potsdam, Truman also learned from his military advisors the projected casualty figures for the invasion of Japan. The Interim Committee, a group of senior civilian advisors convened to advise on atomic bomb policy, had considered and rejected several alternatives. A demonstration explosion on an uninhabited area, a negotiated warning, targeting purely military installations. Their reasoning, presented in the documentary record, included the uncertainty of whether a demonstration would actually compel surrender, the awareness that only 2 bombs were immediately available, and a failed demonstration would squander one, and the assessment that a negotiated warning might allow Japan to locate and destroy the delivery aircraft, or move prisoners of war to the target area. The committee recommended use against cities, without prior specific warning, to achieve the maximum shock effect necessary to compel surrender without invasion. The city of Hiroshima was selected as the primary target for the first bomb. It was a city of approximately 350,000 people, an important military headquarters, an embarkation port, and, significantly for the assessment of bomb damage, a city that had not been substantially damaged by conventional bombing, allowing a clear measurement of the weapon's effects. On the 6th of August, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released a uranium gun-type bomb over Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning. The bomb, designated Little Boy, detonated at approximately 576 meters above the city. The fireball reached a temperature of several thousand degrees. The blast wave flattened approximately 13 square kilometers. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people were killed immediately. By the end of 1945, the death toll from burns, blast injuries, and radiation exposure had risen to estimates between 90,000 and 140,000. The city was, by every surviving account and every subsequent survey, obliterated. The Japanese government did not immediately surrender. This fact is crucial to understanding what followed, and it is a fact that complicates both the narrative that the bomb was exclusively responsible for Japan's surrender and the narrative that Japan was on the verge of surrender anyway, and the bomb was unnecessary. The Japanese Supreme War Council, which required a unanimous decision to proceed, was deadlocked. The military leadership, Army Minister General Korochika Anami, Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Sosemu Toyoda, were prepared to continue fighting even after Hiroshima. Their position was that the war should be continued either until terms could be obtained preserving the imperial system, or until a final decisive battle on the home islands had been fought. The civilian leadership around Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki was seeking terms, but had not been able to build a consensus to surrender even before Hiroshima. On the 8th of August, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched Operation August Storm, the invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Stalin had agreed at Yalta in February to enter the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Germany had surrendered on the 8th of May, placing the Soviet declaration of war on Japan exactly on schedule. Soviet forces struck with a force of approximately 1.5 million troops against the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, which had been stripped of its best units and equipment to defend the home islands. The Kwantung Army collapsed within days. The Soviet entry into the Pacific War was, for many years, underweighted in Western accounts of Japan's decision to surrender, partly because the Cold War created incentives for each side to emphasize different factors. The historiographical consensus in recent decades has shifted toward acknowledging that the Soviet declaration of war was a major, perhaps equally decisive, shock to the Japanese leadership as the atomic bombings. On the 9th of August 1945, a second atomic bomb, a plutonium implosion-type device designated Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The primary target for that day had been the city of Kokura, but it was obscured by cloud. The B-29 Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, diverted to Nagasaki as the secondary target. The bomb detonated at approximately 500 meters above the city. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the geography of Nagasaki, a city in a valley surrounded by hills, confined the blast wave and reduced the total area of destruction compared to Hiroshima, though the bomb's yield was actually larger. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people were killed. Nagasaki was, like Hiroshima, a city that contained significant military installations alongside its civilian population. It was also the home of the largest Catholic Christian community in Japan, a historical irony of the most uncomfortable kind. Emperor Hirohito, speaking in an imperial conference on the night of the 9th and 10th of August, broke the deadlock within the Supreme War Council. In a statement whose exact words have been preserved in the historical record, he said that the time had come to bear the unbearable. He accepted surrender on the condition that the imperial institution be preserved, a condition that the Allied response, carefully worded, accepted obliquely rather than explicitly. On the 15th of August 1945, Hirohito broadcast a recorded speech to the Japanese nation, the first time the Japanese people had ever heard their emperor's voice. He spoke of the new and most cruel bomb and of the Soviet entry into the war. He did not use the word surrender. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of bearing the unbearable. The language, even in translation, retained its extraordinary character. An absolute monarch telling his people, in language his own constitution had never required him to use, that the war was over. The formal surrender ceremony took place on the 2nd of September, 1945, aboard the United States battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for the Japanese government. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed for the Japanese armed forces. General Douglas MacArthur signed as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Representatives of the Allied nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, China, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand, signed in sequence. The ceremony lasted approximately 23 minutes. When it was done, MacArthur stepped to the microphones and spoke briefly. These proceedings are closed. The Second World War was over. 6 years and 1 day had passed since German shells first struck the depot at Westerplatte. The silence that followed the surrender was, in many parts of the world, the first sustained silence from artillery in years. In London, in New York, in Sydney, in Moscow, in the liberated cities of Western Europe, people gathered in streets and squares and wept or cheered, or simply stood very still. In the camps across Asia and Europe, where prisoners of war had survived years of captivity, men and women who had spent years in conditions designed to break them, learned that it was over. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors, the Hibakusha, who had lived through the bomb and its aftermath, began the long process of living with what had been done to and around them. In the villages and farms of Soviet Russia, women and children who had spent 4 years not knowing whether the men who had left would return began to learn, one by one, which of them would not. The silence was not clean. It was enormous and complicated and full of grief, and it was the most welcome sound the world had heard in 6 years. Chapter 16. The World Remade. Consequences, Occupation, and the Cold War's Shadow, 1945 to 1950. The peace that followed the Second World War was not a single event but a process, long, contentious, shaped by agreements made under wartime pressure that revealed their contradictions almost immediately upon implementation. The great conferences of the Wartime Alliance. Tehran in 1943, Yalta in February of 1945, Potsdam in July and August of 1945, had drawn the outline of a post-war world built around four-power occupation of Germany, a new international organization to replace the League of Nations, and a set of territorial arrangements in Eastern Europe that reflected the military reality of where Soviet and Anglo-American forces stood at the moment of Germany's surrender. Within 2 years of that surrender, the alliance that had defeated Hitler was locked in what would become a 40-year confrontation that defined the second half of the 20th century. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was similarly divided into 4 sectors. The intention was joint administration leading to a unified, demilitarized, democratized Germany under a peace treaty. The intention dissolved within months, under the pressure of incompatible visions of what post-war Germany should be. The Soviet zone was stripped of industrial equipment, machinery, rails, entire factory complexes, to compensate for Soviet war losses, while the Western zones received Marshall Plan reconstruction assistance, beginning in 1948. When the Western Allies introduced a new currency in their zones in June of 1948, the Soviet Union responded by blockading West Berlin, blocking all road and rail access. In the first major confrontation of the Cold War, the Western response, the Berlin Airlift, which supplied more than 2 million West Berliners entirely by air for 323 days, forced the Soviets to lift the blockade in May of 1949. Germany was formally divided into 2 states, the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east, and would remain divided for 41 years. In Asia, the consequences of Japan's defeat were equally transformative and equally complex. Japan was occupied by American forces under General MacArthur, who administered what amounted to a top-down revolution in Japanese society. A new constitution that renounced war as an instrument of national policy and stripped the emperor of governmental authority, land reform, dissolution of the Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates, women's suffrage, the establishment of independent labor unions. The American occupation of Japan was, by the measurement of its own stated goals, a remarkably successful transformation. Though its success rested partly on the compliance of a Japanese establishment that saw cooperation as the path to restored sovereignty, and partly on the willingness of the American administration to preserve the imperial institution, which it needed as a symbol of legitimate governance. Emperor Hirohito was not prosecuted at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, a decision that Japanese historians have debated and contested ever since. The vacuum left by the collapse of European colonial power in Asia accelerated independence movements across the continent. The British withdrew from India in August of 1947, a decision shaped by the financial exhaustion of the war, the political impossibility of suppressing a mass independence movement with a stretched and morally weary military, and the changed international legitimacy of colonialism in a world that had just fought a war against racial supremacist ideology. The partition of India into the independent states of India and Pakistan was accompanied by communal violence on a scale that killed somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people. The estimates vary significantly and displaced approximately 14 million. The decolonization of Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies becoming Indonesia, French Indochina collapsing into the First Indochina War, and eventually the American one, followed the same pattern of colonial authority fatally undermined by the Japanese occupation years. The Second World War had not merely destroyed the old European order in Europe, it had destroyed the European claim to authority across Asia. China's story requires specific acknowledgement because it is the most frequently underweighted thread in Western narratives of the Second World War. China had been at war with Japan since 1937, 2 years before the European War began, and had suffered casualties that dwarf those of every Western nation individually. Estimates of total Chinese war dead, military and civilian, across the entire Sino-Japanese conflict range from approximately 8 million to 20 million. The Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek had held out in Chongqing through 8 years of war, maintaining the front that kept millions of Japanese troops occupied in China, rather than available for operations against Allied forces elsewhere. The contribution of Chinese resistance to the Allied victory is not adequately captured in any simple accounting. And the China that emerged from the war was not the China that the nationalists had hoped to build. The civil war between nationalists and communists, suspended during the Japanese conflict, resumed immediately after the surrender. By October of 1949, the Communist Party under Mao Zedong had prevailed, and Chiang's government had retreated to Taiwan. The political consequences are still unresolved. The United Nations, established by the Charter signed in San Francisco on the 26th of June 1945, was built on the specific institutional lesson of the League of Nations failure. It gave the 5 major Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China, permanent seats on the Security Council with veto power over council resolutions, ensuring that no resolution could be passed against the interests of any great power. This structure made the UN effective at maintaining the broad architecture of international order, while making it structurally incapable of acting decisively when the great powers disagreed, which was most of the time during the Cold War. The tension between the UN's idealistic founding documents and the political reality of great power competition has defined the organization's history from the signing of its charter to the present day. It was the right institution for the world that actually existed, rather than the world its founders hoped existed. The human reckoning with what the war had cost took decades, and is, in some respects, still underway. The total number of dead across all combatants and all theaters is estimated between 70 million and 85 million human beings, making the Second World War the deadliest conflict in recorded human history. Of those, the majority, by a substantial margin, were civilians. The Soviet Union alone lost approximately 27 million. China lost between 15 and 20 million. Poland lost approximately 6 million, roughly 17% of its entire pre-war population, the highest proportional loss of any nation in the war. The United States, whose entry proved decisive and whose industrial capacity supplied the Allied war effort, lost approximately 400,000 military dead, a devastating number, yet a fraction of what the Eastern European nations endured. The asymmetry of suffering in the Second World War is itself a historical and political fact, with consequences that have not fully resolved. The Nuremberg Principles, the legal framework established by the International Military Tribunal, entered international law and became the foundation for subsequent tribunals. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal for Japanese war crimes, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and eventually, the International Criminal Court established by the Rome Statute of 1998. The idea that crimes against humanity are prosecutable regardless of whether they were ordered by a state, and that the defense of following orders provides no immunity from prosecution, was established at Nuremberg and has been imperfectly but persistently applied ever since. Every international war crimes proceeding since 1945 rests, however indirectly, on the scaffolding built in that Nuremberg courtroom. The nuclear age that began at Alamogordo on the 16th of July, 1945, and was applied at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, permanently transformed the relationship between military power and political decision-making. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic device on the 29th of August, 1949, 4 years after the American program had demonstrated the technology. The British tested their first device in October of 1952. The hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon of vastly greater yield, was tested by the United States in November of 1952 and by the Soviet Union less than a year later. By the mid-1950s, both superpowers possessed weapons capable of destroying entire metropolitan areas with single devices, and delivery systems capable of reaching any point on Earth. The condition of mutual assured destruction, in which any nuclear exchange would produce casualties incompatible with the survival of either civilization, had been reached. The Second World War had ended. The age of potential annihilation it had ushered in had not. The Marshall Plan, formerly the European Recovery Program, proposed by Secretary of State George Marshall at Harvard University on the 5th of June, 1947, committed approximately $13 billion of American economic assistance to the reconstruction of Western European economies, the equivalent of roughly $160 billion in current values. Its explicit purpose was economic reconstruction. Its implicit strategic purpose was to prevent the political conditions of post-war economic despair from producing the same result they had produced in Germany after the First World War: the rise of extremist parties feeding on economic misery. It worked. Western European democracies rebuilt. The democratic institutions that the war had been fought to preserve survived. By the early 1950s, Western Germany was producing steel and automobiles again. By the 1960s, the countries that had spent 6 years destroying each other were building the institutional architecture of what would become the European Union. History does not often produce developments so directly and deliberately learned from catastrophe. This one did. Chapter 17. Memory, Legacy, and Why It Still Matters. The long aftermath. Every generation inherits a war it did not fight. The inheritance of the Second World War has been exceptionally complicated. because the war's outcomes did not produce the kind of moral clarity that wartime propaganda had promised. The Allied powers won. The ideologies of Nazism and Japanese militarism were defeated, but the Soviet Union, whose sacrifice and military effort were indispensable to that victory, was simultaneously a totalitarian state that had murdered its own citizens by the millions, that occupied Eastern Europe after the war with methods that bore disturbing structural resemblances to the occupation it had helped defeat, and that would, within a few years of victory, be the primary strategic adversary of the Western democracies. The task of holding simultaneously in mind the Soviet Union's genuine heroism and genuine criminality has tested every subsequent generation that has tried to understand the war honestly. The memory of the Second World War has been differently curated in different countries, and the differences are themselves historical facts of significance. In the United States, the war is remembered as the Good War, a conflict of unambiguous moral clarity, in which American entry decided the outcome and American sacrifice liberated Europe and Asia. This memory is not false. It reflects real sacrifices and real moral stakes, but it sometimes sits awkwardly alongside the historical record of American racial segregation within the armed forces. The internment of more than 120,000 Japanese Americans, under Executive Order 9066, the limited American response to the deportation and murder of European Jews, and the decisions at Yalta that consigned Eastern Europe to Soviet domination in exchange for Soviet entry into the Pacific War and cooperative management of the post-war order. A complete memory is necessarily more complicated than a triumphalist one. In the United Kingdom, the war memory has centered on the years of standing alone. The summer and autumn of 1940, Churchill's speeches, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, in ways that have sometimes overshadowed the years that followed and the contributions of the Empire and Commonwealth that made British survival possible. More than 2,500,000 Indian soldiers served in the British Armed Forces during the Second World War. Australian, Canadian, South African, and New Zealand forces fought in virtually every theatre. The Free French, the Polish forces in exile, the Norwegian, Dutch, Belgian, Czech, and Greek governments and their armed forces, the resistance movements across occupied Europe. The Allied victory was a coalition achievement on a scale that the national memorials of individual countries do not always fully communicate. The act of remembering is also an act of selection, and what is selected reflects priorities that are not always purely historical. Germany's relationship with the memory of the Second World War is in many respects the most seriously and deliberately engaged of any nation. The concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the working through or coming to terms with the past, has shaped German education, law, public commemoration, and political culture since the founding of the Federal Republic. Holocaust denial is a criminal offense in Germany. The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, opened in Berlin in 2005, occupies a city center location of approximately 19,000 square meters. A physical commitment of space in the capital to memory and responsibility that has no real parallel elsewhere. This process was not smooth or linear. West German society in the 1950s was deeply invested in the myth of widespread German ignorance of the Holocaust, and in the narrative that the true Nazis had been punished at Nuremberg, while ordinary Germans had simply been soldiers following orders. The cultural and political confrontation with the fuller truth came in phases. Through the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of the mid-1960s, through the broadcast of the American television series Holocaust in 1979, through the historians' debate of the 1980s over the uniqueness of the Nazi genocide, and through the continuing work of institutions like the Documentation Center at the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg. Japan's relationship with its own wartime record is more contested, both domestically and internationally. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal convicted and executed 7 Class A war criminals, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, and sentenced others to imprisonment. But the trial excluded Emperor Hirohito from prosecution, a decision made for political reasons, and did not produce the kind of sweeping national reckoning that Nuremberg had attempted in Germany. Japanese textbook controversies, recurring disputes about how the Second World War, the Nanjing Massacre, and Japanese colonial administration in Korea and China are described in state-approved school curriculum, have been a persistent source of diplomatic friction with China, South Korea, and other Asian nations from the 1980s to the present. The comfort women issue, the system of sexual slavery organized by the Imperial Japanese military, which subjected women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories to systematic abuse, remained a source of unresolved diplomatic conflict between Japan and South Korea through the 1990s and beyond. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, a Shinto memorial that commemorates Japan's war dead and includes among those enshrined 14 Class A war criminals, is visited by Japanese politicians in ways that periodically produce diplomatic incidents with neighboring nations. Japan's memory of the war is not a single agreed narrative. It is a contested space in which very different accounts of agency, responsibility, and victimhood compete. The physical landscapes of the Second World War have become, in the decades since the fighting ended, among the most visited and most carefully preserved sites on Earth. The beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword receive millions of visitors each year, drawn by the cemetery rows of white crosses at Colleville-sur-Mer, by the preserved bunkers, by the sense of standing on ground where something of immense historical weight occurred. The sites of the Nazi extermination camps in Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, are preserved as memorials and designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites, maintained as physical evidence against the denial that those who perpetrated the Holocaust hoped would eventually erase it. The battlefields of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, the Kursk salient, the approaches to Leningrad, are less accessible to Western visitors and less integrated into the dominant Western memory of the war. A geographical distribution of commemorative attention that itself reflects the asymmetries in how the conflict is understood across the former adversaries and allies. The veterans of the Second World War are now almost entirely gone. The last confirmed surviving veteran of the First World War died in 2012. The youngest veterans of the Second World War, those who served in the final months and were born in 1927 or 1928, are approaching or past 100 years of age. Within the next decade, living memory of the conflict will have ended entirely. What remains after living memory ends is what institutions, educators, and individuals choose to preserve and transmit. The documentary record, the archival film, the testimony preserved in oral history projects before the witnesses died, the material culture in museums, and the histories written by scholars working from documents that the participants left behind. The responsibility of transmission is not a trivial one. The Second World War is close enough that its direct consequences, the borders of Europe, the existence of Israel, the United Nations Charter, the nuclear arsenals of the great powers, the decolonized nations of Asia and Africa, are still the structural features of the world we live in. It is not ancient history requiring only academic attention. It is the foundation of the present. The question that haunts every serious study of the Second World War is whether its lessons have been learned or merely repeated in different registers. The Nuremberg Principles were cited in the prosecution of war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, in Sudan, always imperfectly, always against the resistance of powerful states unwilling to apply to themselves the standards they endorsed applying to others. The refugee crisis created by the Second World War, the displaced persons camps, the stateless populations, the survivors of the camps seeking any country that would take them, produced the 1951 Refugee Convention, which established the legal framework for the protection of refugees that has governed international practice for 75 years. That framework is under more political pressure today than at almost any point since its creation. The institutions built from the rubble of the Second World War were built by people who had seen what happened when those institutions did not exist. Maintaining them requires a sustained act of collective will from people who increasingly have not seen that. The final accounting of the Second World War resists simplification in every direction. It was not simply a triumph of good over evil, though genuine evil was defeated. It was not simply an inevitable consequence of the First World War and the Versailles settlement, though those roots ran deep. It was not the result of a single man's pathology, though that pathology was real and consequential. It was the product of accumulated decisions by democratic governments that appeased when they should have resisted, by militaries that planned for the wrong war, by populations that preferred comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths, by scientists who built weapons without fully imagining their use, and by the millions of ordinary people in dozens of countries who made individual choices under impossible pressures that aggregated across 6 years, produced the historical record we have spent the past several hours examining. The war teaches something different to everyone who studies it seriously, because it contains something different for everyone. What it does not contain, for anyone who engages with it honestly, is simplicity. This documentary has covered more than 6 years of the most intense military, political, industrial, and human conflict in recorded history, across every theater from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic convoys to the North African desert, from the skies over Britain to the tunnels of Iwo Jima, from the conference rooms of Yalta to the bunker in Berlin. We have tried, throughout, to be precise where precision is possible, to acknowledge debate where debate is genuine, and to bring to the surface the human beings, their choices, their failures, their courage, and their crimes, beneath the statistics and the strategy. History is not a sequence of events. It is the accumulated record of human decisions, made under conditions of imperfect knowledge, often under enormous pressure, sometimes heroically, and often catastrophically. The Second World War is the largest collection of such decisions in history. Understanding it is not an academic exercise. It is the most important preparation for understanding the world you live in, the institutions you depend on, and the choices your own generation will be called to make. We have reached the end of this film. The war is over. The world it made is still here.